I'm Enrique. I'm going to be talking about the minimum wage increase. In the recently popular movement, the Fight for 15, advocates tout that the increase in the minimum wage would help those impoverished escape financial hardship. However, I claim that this is incorrect and that the minimum wage would actually do more harm than good in two key ways. One is that the increase in labor costs would result in reduced hours as businesses either automate or increase demand and productivity. The second is that services for those who most rely on, public services for those who most rely on them will be most impacted by the minimum wage and therefore cost more to use. My first point is that typically the increases in minimum wage reduce hours of jobs for low wage and low skilled workers. The increase to $15 per hour has recently been tested in Seattle, Washington, and in response, the Washington University performed a study to measure the policy's effect on the city's low-wage workers. One finding is that the Seattle minimum wage ordinance caused hours worked by low-skilled workers earning under $19 an hour to fall by 6.9%. Because of this, the average employee lost $130 worth of lost hours. $56 of this was recuperated due to higher wages, leading to a net $76 loss over the course of each month for the average low-wage earning person who actually retained their job. The low-skilled workers category is typically composed of those under 25 who are just entering the workforce with little or no prior experience, such as working through college, graduating high school, or who have come from a family business. According to the Washington Post, hourly workers under 25 make up 1/5 of the total workforce, but a full one-half of those who make minimum wage or less. And the Bureau of Labor reports that the hourly workforce accounts for 60% of the total workforce. 3.3% of those are men. 3.3% of men earn under minimum wage, and 5.4% of women earn under minimum wage. The Heritage Foundation reports that 79% of all minimum wage workers are part-time, 62% are enrolled in school currently, and only 22% live in a family that ends up below the poverty line. Meaning that the increase of the minimum wage would predominantly help the upper middle classes, not the lower class and low skilled workers. Increased wages would also set a higher skill bar into entry to the minimum wage positions, as overall productivity would have to increase to justify the higher wage. The lowest skilled and lowest value workers would be excluded from those new jobs. Secondly, the increased minimum wage will most affect services that the impoverished use, increasing their cost. The people who claim to most benefit from the new wage hikes often do not work at or below the proposed federal minimum wage. In fact, just 4% of single parents work a minimum wage job, putting this figure below the national average of 5.6% of all hourly workers. In Seattle, there were no direct job losses, according to the Washington University study, but what was observed is a decrease in new jobs compared to the outside area. So while the increase in minimum wage did not directly get anyone fired, what it did do was it changed the behavior of employers so that they stopped hiring new, unskilled workers and instead opted to retain their already trained workforce. In 2016, the city of Seattle raised the payment it offers to low-income families needing assistance paying for childcare in response to the wage ordinance to help retain low-income families in licensed care. The very people this wage hike was supposed to help were the ones who needed additional assistance to afford childcare. And in order to ensure that these people did not send their children into unlicensed daycare centers, the city expanded a welfare program that had taxpayers paying the difference. In conclusion, while increasing the minimum wage sounds like it may help those in lower paying positions, the reality is when put into practice, it ends up having the opposite effect. People who make the minimum wage can't get enough hours to work, new positions aren't created, and new positions don't open up to these unskilled workers, and the child care becomes prohibitively expensive, forcing welfare programs to expand to keep the children in certified establishments. Thank you.
Right, I like the background information on the Fight for 15 and the movement that there is to try and increase the minimum wage. I think that gives us a justification for talking about this. You've got a pretty clear statement of your proposition that does more harm than benefit. You've got a preview of what the secondary points are. That's fine. The second point was a little bit awkwardly phrased, and when you got to it in the body of the speech, it got to be a little bit clear. And then when you explained it, I understood what you were talking about. But when you first presented it, it was unclear what it was that you were saying is happening. And I think there's got to be a more explicit or clearer way, simpler way to say that particular point. On the first point, there's a reasonable explanation about why there's going to be a loss of revenue for people at this level. You've got an interesting example that illustrates that in Seattle. There's some statistical information that sort of demonstrates how this works and what the net loss would be to those people in those areas. And I thought that was fine. And then there's quite a bit of information, statistical information about the number of people who are working at minimum wage jobs, what their age groups are, what their genders are, and what their family status is. I think you need to explain a little bit more what the implications of this are. I think there's an argument that says that the need for wages here is less critical, or that higher wages are going to have a bigger impact on people because they're in these particular categories. It wasn't quite clear once I got all that information what it was I was supposed to infer from it, and I think that that's important, because there's an argument there that you've provided good information for, but you aren't giving us the completed claim on that. The last part of the argument there is that people with limited skills are going to have a harder time getting access and become part of the workforce. It's going to set the bar higher, as you say, and I like that idea. I think that needs to be explained a little bit more, and we need some evidence that documents it. On the second point, basically your argument here is that higher minimum wages will actually result in having to pay for greater public welfare services. Maybe that's the way to simplify the statement. And then you give an explanation about what the chain of reasoning is on that particular point. You've got some statistical information that explains that. Some of that might tie in with the information that you had on that first point, the wage earners in those different categories. So maybe some of that information would be applicable here. And then you've got the example of what happened in Seattle. That's pretty reasonable. So at the end, I thought that you had a pretty good summary of your arguments. You still have more time to add some additional information here and there, but I thought it was a good start. I think that one of the things that's missing is the notion that there would be, you would just have a loss of hours, and you kind of accept the one study that suggests that nobody lost their job in the Seattle area, but I think that there's good information that suggests that higher minimum wages, especially at the levels that are being talked about in different places, the Fight for 15 thing, for instance, there's good reason to believe that there might be a net impact on the total number of jobs as well. So you seem hesitant to make that argument. I'm not sure that there's a reason that you couldn't make that argument since you have more time. All right, but that's your choice. All right, thank you.